The silence was the worst part. Not the silence of a late August night on the Illinois prairie that was usually filled with the whirring of cicadas and the distant hum of the interstate, but a deep, unnatural vacuum of sound that swallowed even the noise of 11-year-old Mikey Johnson's own frantic breathing. Mikey wasn't supposed to be awake. He'd crept downstairs for a glass of water, only to find the kitchen bathed in a pulsing, indigo glow that wasn't moonlight. He pressed his face against the dusty pane of the back window, the cool glass shocking against his skin, and what he saw erased every childish fantasy and replaced it with a primal, suffocating fear. Hovering maybe 40 feet above the ripe, swaying tassels of their cornfield was not a machine, but an absolute geometric presence. It was a triangle, impossibly large, spanning what looked like the distance between their farmhouse and the old abandoned silo on the property line, meaning it was easily the size of 2 football fields laid end to end. Along the 3 vertices were lights, huge, dull crimson orbs that seemed to draw the light into them rather than project it. But the center, the terrifying heart of the thing, was dominated by a single, colossal white light, pure and unwavering, burning with an intensity that felt less like illumination and more like observation. This object, whatever it was, moved with zero respect for gravity or aerodynamics. It simply floated motionless for what felt like an hour, though Mikey would later realize it was only a few minutes. It cast no shadow because the light came from within the object itself, an internalized, impossible luminescence. The air outside felt suddenly heavy, electric, buzzing with an energy that vibrated in Mikey's teeth. He didn't dare wake his parents, terrified that if he made a sound, if he broke the unholy quiet, this titanic sentinel would finally acknowledge his presence. The weight of its existence was crushing, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that it redefined the concept of human helplessness. He watched one of the crimson lights briefly dim and then brighten again, a slow, biological pulse, before the entire massive structure, without any warning, without the slightest ripple in the air or the faintest whisper of exhaust, tilted infinitesimally, and then accelerated straight up, shattering the visual horizon in perhaps 2 seconds. The sound barrier was utterly ignored. It simply wasn't there. When it was gone, the cicadas immediately roared back into life. The air conditioner kicked back on with a shuddering clatter, and the mundane world rushed back in, leaving Mikey sweating, trembling, and entirely alone with the chilling certainty that what he had witnessed was not of this earth, and that it knew exactly where he lived. The next morning was a suffocating exercise in denial. Mikey's parents, Jim and Carol, were hardworking farmers, practical people who dealt in bushels, futures, and the harsh realities of Midwestern weather. When Mikey, white-faced and exhausted, stammered out his account of the silent, stadium-sized triangle, Jim immediately attributed it to a night terror brought on by too much late-night television. Carol suggested he might have seen a distant airplane or perhaps the powerful floodlights from a neighboring farm's late harvest operation. But Mikey knew better. He knew the difference between a nightmare and the cold reality of that indigo pulse. He tried to draw it, his shaky pencil struggling to capture the sheer scale and the unnatural geometry. The drawings looked childish, silly even, a stark insult to the terrifying magnificence of the actual object, and his frustration only amplified his sense of isolation. But the silence that had gripped the cornfield the previous night was slowly beginning to crack across the county. Later that afternoon, when Jim drove into the small town of Harmony Creek for feed supplies, he heard the whispers. Old Man Peters, who lived 6 miles east, was rambling about a silent, hovering shape that had caused his dogs to hide under the porch for hours. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, had called the police reporting a massive light show over the reservoir. By the time Sheriff Deputy Rick Hansen arrived for his shift in the early evening, the incident log was unusually thick. Hansen, a former Army Reserve logistical officer, was a man who believed in chain of command and empirical evidence. He dismissed the first few calls as astronomical confusion or drunk drivers, but the reports quickly developed a disturbing uniformity. Everyone from the teenage couple necking by the county line to the shift workers of the grain elevator described the exact same thing. A colossal, dark, triangular form, silent, slow-moving, and bearing those signature 3 red lights and the central blinding white beam. Hansen drove out to the Johnson farm, less to investigate and more to mollify the shaken family. He spoke to Mikey, expecting hysteria, but found a child describing complex flight mechanics and light absorption with an eerie, clinical precision. When Hansen looked out over the cornfield, he saw nothing but the ordinary sweep of the sunset. Yet the air felt charged, and a strange, metallic odor, faint but definitely present, hung near the edge of the property where Mikey claimed the object had hovered. Hansen left with a knot tightening in his stomach, realizing that this was not hysteria. This was a consistent, terrifying phenomenon, and his rational world was beginning to fray at the edges. He started making discreet calls to the nearest Air National Guard base, but the answer was always the same: negative activity, deputy. Clear skies. The wave, initially a ripple of localized sightings, rapidly became a deluge of highly consistent testimony, solidifying the object's identity across the Midwestern sky. It wasn't just lights anymore. It was the definitive black triangle, a nickname that quickly spread via CB radio and early internet bulletin boards before the mainstream media had even grasped the scope of the phenomenon. Witnesses from Decatur to Peoria, stretching across the state and bleeding into Indiana, described a geometric menace operating with impossible physical properties. The defining characteristic, apart from the immense size, was the sheer audacity of its movement. We have multiple documented accounts from experienced air traffic controllers and commercial pilots who tracked these objects on radar, observing them execute 90-degree turns at speeds that would vaporize any known earthly craft and its occupants. A semi-truck driver named Dale, pulling a load of soybeans outside Joliet, provided one of the most chilling visual accounts. He claimed the triangle descended so low that he had to slam on his brakes, convinced he was about to collide with a rogue aircraft. Dale testified that the craft was not metallic but had a matte black finish like highly compressed soot, and the edges seemed to absorb all ambient light, making the stars behind it visible right up to its razor-sharp outline, giving it a two-dimensional, cutout quality that defied depth perception. The silent movement remained the most baffling aspect. A craft of that enormous displacement should generate massive sonic boom shock waves, even at low subsonic speeds, or at the very least, a deafening mechanical roar from its propulsion system. Yet every single witness confirmed the absence of sound, save for that strange, ambient electromagnetic hum, a low-frequency vibration that many described as feeling more internal than external, like a sudden pressure change in the inner ear. The official responses, meanwhile, were sputtering attempts to reclaim narrative control. Initial reports claimed rare military stealth prototypes, despite the objects being sighted daily for weeks. Then came the classic high-altitude weather balloons, and finally, the rather desperate, unidentified birds migrating in tight V formations illuminated by city lights. The problem was that these explanations were immediately and laughably dismissed by the sheer volume and credibility of the witnesses. Police officers, pilots, meteorologists, and farmers who understood the skies better than any desk-bound government spokesperson. The geometric precision, the speed, the absolute silence, and the continuous appearance meant that the 1990s Midwestern sky was hosting something operating entirely outside the parameters of known human technology. And the terror began to transition from fear of the unknown to fear of official deception. The constant, maddening inconsistency between what people saw and what the authorities insisted they saw was the precise entry point for Sarah Vance. Sarah was a tenacious investigative reporter for the regional paper in Springfield, usually covering zoning disputes and city council graft. When the first few scattered reports of flying triangles hit her desk, she rolled her eyes. UFOs were for tabloids, not serious journalism. But then, the sheer volume of calls began to overwhelm the local police scanner she monitored. She realized this wasn't one isolated incident. It was a sustained operation spanning hundreds of square miles. What shifted her perspective from skeptic to zealous investigator was the testimony of a retired Air Force maintenance chief who lived near her, a man who knew aircraft nomenclature better than his own children's names. He admitted, hesitantly, that he had witnessed the triangular object performing maneuvers that were physically impossible for anything designed on this planet. He also confided in Sarah that when he tried to report it to his old contacts, his call was immediately disconnected, followed by a sterile, recorded message about non-emergency lines being temporarily disabled. Sarah recognized the subtle scent of a cover-up, not necessarily to hide aliens, but to hide something the government was doing. She began filing Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests, focusing initially on flight paths from nearby military bases, specifically the suspected maneuvers of B-2 bombers or experimental drone programs. Every single request was met with delays, redactions so heavy they rendered the documents useless, or outright denial on grounds of national security. This bureaucratic stonewalling only fueled her suspicion. She started interviewing the witnesses face-to-face, driving countless miles across dusty farm roads, meticulously recording their testimonies, not just for content, but for tone and credibility. She noted that many witnesses shared common psychosomatic reactions: migraines, temporary light sensitivity, and, most disturbingly, brief but profound gaps in memory immediately following the sighting, particularly when the central white light was directly observed. The deeper she dug, the clearer the picture became. The massive triangles were not performing stealth operations. They were performing public demonstrations of dominance, and the only entities scrambling to hide the evidence were the local and federal authorities, who seemed determined to bury the truth under a mountain of misinformation and dismissive silence, turning ordinary citizens into willing prisoners of their own terrifying observations. The events of October 12, 1995, forever cemented the wave in the Midwestern consciousness. It was the night of the Great Convergence, a spectacle so widely witnessed and documented that subsequent debunking attempts were rendered utterly impotent. It was a perfectly clear night, warm for the season, and hundreds of people had gathered, mostly spontaneously, in the fields and parking lots outside the towns after rumors had circulated that the lights were due to return to their usual patrol route along the main power corridor. The air was thick with anticipation, fear, and dozens of cameras, primitive camcorders and 35mm film cameras, ready to capture what skeptics insisted was nothing but lens flare or Venus. Around 9:30 p.m., the silence returned, the sudden cessation of local sound acting as the unmistakable herald. Then they appeared, not one, but three enormous black triangles, executing slow, synchronized formation maneuvers over the open prairie. They moved like colossal, silent dancers, maintaining perfect, equidistant spacing, sometimes holding a formation like an inverted delta, sometimes rotating slowly to form a vast, moving triangle of triangles. The central white light on the lead craft pulsed rhythmically, and as it did, people reported their radios cutting out, streetlights flickering in sequence, and car engines sputtering momentarily. The sheer scale was terrifying. Watching these immense, silent structures occupy the sky directly above was like witnessing the absolute erasure of natural law. For over 45 minutes, they dominated the nocturnal landscape, utterly indifferent to the hundreds of bewildered humans staring up at them. This convergence was not stealth. It was a brazen, undeniable display of power that forced everyone present, from Deputy Hanson, who was supervising the crowds, to the Johnson family, who watched from their porch, to confront the terrifying reality of their situation. They were not alone, and whatever was operating these craft possessed technology that made the height of American military might look like children's toys. After the convergence, the community struggled to fit this impossible reality into their everyday lives. How do you go back to farming or selling insurance when you know colossal, silent objects that defy gravity are monitoring your existence? The fundamental conflict of the Midwestern Wave was crystallized that night. The evidence was irrefutable, Yet the official response remained a staunch, insulting denial. It forces us, even decades later, to ask a profound question. If the truth of these impossible phenomena meant shattering everything you believed about physics, safety, and your government, would you still demand to know the absolute truth, or would you prefer the comforting lie the authorities provided? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. The collective testimony is the only thing that stands against the official erasure. The night of the Great Convergence was a visual spectacle, but the subsequent incidents escalated the terror from observation to potential physical contact. The high strangeness factor, as investigators call it, began to manifest. One of the most compelling and disturbing secondary cases involved a 27-year-old truck driver named Marcus, hauling refrigerated goods on I-55 near Normal, Illinois. Marcus was a highly reliable witness, known for his clockwork schedule and rigorous honesty. Around 3 a.m., he experienced the typical pre-sighting symptoms, the pervasive, deep silence and a strange, metallic ozone smell filling his cab. He pulled over to investigate, assuming a mechanical failure, and that's when the light hit him. Not the huge central beam, but a secondary, highly focused blue-white beam emanating from the underside of the craft, which was hovering silently directly over the interchange. Marcus reported an instantaneous transition from fear to a profound sense of paralysis and mental clarity, a feeling he described later as being completely focused, yet unable to move a muscle. His next conscious memory was pulling back onto the highway for hours later, with the sun already creeping over the horizon. His digital clock in the cab confirmed the 4-hour temporal gap. He had no memory of what transpired, only a crushing sense of loss, disorientation, and a persistent, burning pain behind his left ear. When he finally made it to his destination, his colleague noticed 2 tiny, perfectly circular puncture marks, barely a millimeter wide, symmetrically placed behind his mastoid bone, which were not there before he started his shift. Marcus refused to go to the police, fearing ridicule and potential loss of his commercial license. But he confided in Sarah Vance, showing her the strange marks which looked like biopsy points. Sarah, collaborating with a small, independent research group, managed to obtain soil samples from the patch of shoulder where Marcus had stopped. The analysis revealed an unusually high level of trace metallic isotopes, elements not naturally occurring in Midwestern soil, including small amounts of highly purified titanium and magnesium silicate, sintered together as if exposed to unimaginable heat. The most alarming discovery, however, was the strange residue found clinging to the underside of Marcus's truck trailer, a fine, dark, oily powder that defied easy chemical categorization, exhibiting properties similar to high-density polymers but evaporating quickly when exposed to sunlight. These physical remnants, combined with the inexplicable memory loss and the traumatic physical markers, shifted the investigation from what are they to what are they doing to us. The close encounters had begun, moving the way from a passive demonstration to an active, invasive presence in the lives of rural Americans, reinforcing the terrifying realization that they were not merely observers, but potentially subjects in a grand silent experiment. Deputy Rick Hansen's involvement, initially driven by professional duty and later by confused curiosity, had evolved into a personal, moral crisis. He was the frontline authority figure, the one expected to provide reassurance and enforce the official line. Yet everything he saw, heard, and documented contradicted the sanitized reports emanating from state and federal agencies. He started keeping a secondary, unofficial log, hidden deep within his personal safe, detailing the inconsistencies that plagued the official record. The first red flag was the disappearance of key radar tapes. When the Great Convergence occurred, the local FAA tower recorded substantial, non-transponder traffic moving at impossible speeds. When Hansen requested copies for his report, he was told the tapes were corrupted due to unforeseen atmospheric conditions. This explanation was clearly ridiculous. He had spoken directly to the FAA technician who confirmed the tracks existed before they vanished. The second major red flag was the sudden appearance of unmarked government vehicles in Harmony Creek. These weren't FBI or state police. These were sterile, dark sedans driven by pale men in ill-fitting suits who introduced themselves vaguely as special investigators. They weren't interested in securing the safety of the population. They were interested only in interviewing and often intimidating the most articulate witnesses, like the Johnsons and the truck driver, Marcus. Hansen observed their tactics, subtly shifting witness narratives, introducing alternative and unprovable explanations, and applying gentle but firm pressure to encourage silence. One evening, after interviewing a witness who had photographed the triangle, one of these investigators asked Hansen to forget he had seen the photograph, implying that continuing to pursue the topic would be detrimental to his career longevity and the safety of his family. This was the turning point for Hansen. He wasn't just dealing with an atmospheric mystery anymore. He was dealing with an organized campaign of suppression orchestrated by unseen, powerful forces whose primary objective was to maintain ignorance. His loyalty to the uniform fractured. He knew that the lie being propagated was more dangerous than the truth of the lights themselves, because the lie stripped the community of its autonomy and its ability to prepare. From that moment, Hansen became a secret ally to Sarah Vance, carefully leaking minor details and confirming the dates and times of official obfuscation, risking everything he had built on the precarious promise that the truth, however terrifying, must eventually emerge. As the evidence mounted within the community, physical marks, memory gaps, undeniable radar tracks, and hundreds of consistent testimonies, the official response shifted from simple denial to a calculated and corrosive campaign of psychological warfare. This was not a physical invasion, but a strategic invasion of belief. If they couldn't convince the population that the sightings were imaginary, they would convince them that the witnesses were unreliable, paranoid, or mentally unstable. Local media, often influenced by mysterious official sources or facing economic pressure, began running stories that focused heavily on the most outlandish claims, deliberately conflating credible testimonies with fringe conspiracy theories to taint the whole phenomenon. Suddenly, the news wasn't about the solid geometry and silent speed of the craft. It was about cow mutilations and alien implants, effectively muddling the narrative into ridicule. This noise campaign worked insidiously. People who had been willing to talk a month prior suddenly grew quiet, afraid of being labeled locally as the town lunatic. Sarah Vance found her access drying up, and her editors began to express concerns about the paper's dedication of resources to sensationalist topics. She received anonymous threats, not violent ones, but chilling reminders that her professional life depended on her discretion. A phone call informed her, calmly, that her financial history was under review, a clear intimidation tactic designed to induce silence through fear of investigation. The authorities amplified the most ludicrous official explanations, dedicating resources to proving, for instance, that 3 simultaneous weather balloons had been launched from 3 separate states, and somehow maintained perfect formation for 2 hours while reflecting light in a way that mimicked internal illumination. The public, bombarded by contradictory information and pressured by social stigma, entered a state of cognitive dissonance. They knew what they saw, yet the world insisted they were hallucinating. This systematic undermining of shared reality was perhaps the most frightening element of the entire wave. The realization that the apparatus of power was dedicated not to solving the mystery, but to actively ensuring its perpetuation and the marginalization of those who dared to speak the terrifying truth. The climax of the wave arrived in late spring of 1996, several months after the initial peak, catching the complacent public off guard. The sightings had become sporadic, leading many to believe the objects had retreated or moved on to another theater of operation. This final aggressive demonstration occurred not over a remote cornfield, but directly over the densely populated central business district of a moderate-sized town, leveraging the public's renewed sense of normalcy for maximum impact. It happened just before midnight. The triangular object, perhaps the largest one yet reported, appeared silently and slowly over the main power substation. Unlike previous sightings where the craft maintained altitude, this one descended, hovering aggressively at a dangerously low altitude, low enough that witnesses could discern fine details on its matte black surface, details like faint seams or panel lines that seemed to seal a perfectly smooth exterior. As it passed directly over the substation, the town experienced a massive, simultaneous power grid failure. The sudden, absolute blackness was startling, throwing the streets into chaos. For 3 terrifying minutes, the colossal, silent shape drifted slowly down the main thoroughfare, illuminated only by the faint, pulsing crimson lights on its corners. Car alarms shrieked randomly, trapped inside the electronic interference field the craft seemed to generate. The fear was palpable and collective, a wave of cold dread washing over everyone who witnessed the deliberate, menacing maneuver. This was not an accidental flyby. It was an intentional, intimate display of technological superiority designed to convey a single, terrifying message. We control your infrastructure. We control your safety. The Johnson family, who tried to move past their initial encounter, watched the news coverage with sickening certainty. Carol finally broke down, declaring she could no longer raise her children in a place where the air above their heads was controlled by silent, hostile, and utterly unknown forces. The next week, they put the farm up for sale, willing to sacrifice their ancestral home and livelihood to escape the constant, invisible threat. The final, close-range sighting and the accompanying power outage served as the definitive, traumatic coda to the Midwestern Wave, forcing hundreds of thousands to grapple with the reality that they were not merely sharing the sky, but were living beneath an unacknowledged and terrifying jurisdiction. The intense activity ceased almost as abruptly as it began. By the late summer of 1996, the massive, silent triangles were gone. The Midwestern skies returned to the mundane domain of commercial airliners and the occasional military transport. But the withdrawal brought no peace. It left behind deep psychological craters in the communities affected. For the Johnsons, moving 3 states away provided physical distance, but the memory of that colossal, silent presence over their cornfield remained a raw, open wound. Mikey, now a teenager, developed severe anxiety about nighttime and clear skies, forever associating the stars with surveillance and fear. For Deputy Hansen, the closure of the case felt incomplete, dishonest. The special investigators vanished just as quickly as the triangles, leaving behind stacks of officially concluded files riddled with holes and conflicting reports, all pointing to the final, unsatisfactory conclusion of misidentification of civil aircraft. Hansen knew the truth remained locked in his personal safe, and the burden of that unshared knowledge aged him prematurely. Sarah Vance, despite the threats and professional pressure, managed to publish a lengthy, meticulous summary of her findings, but it was largely relegated to the back pages, dismissed by metropolitan news outlets as regional eccentricity. The story of the impossible lights faded from the headlines, replaced by the relentless churn of national news cycles. Yet, the legacy of the Midwestern Wave endures not in official records, which were either purged or classified, but in the collective memory and ongoing trauma of thousands of witnesses. These people live knowing they were not hallucinating, that they were targeted, observed, and silenced by powers far greater than they could comprehend, be they extraterrestrial or an extraordinarily advanced, clandestine terrestrial program. The silence now is just as chilling as the vacuum of sound that preceded the sightings, a calculated quiet imposed by the forces that successfully erased one of the most widespread and documented UFO waves in American history from the national consciousness, leaving behind a profound question. What happens when the truth is so terrifying, the authorities decide it's better left buried? The witnesses of the 1990s Midwestern Wave carry that answer, a heavy, secret knowledge that defines America's UFO legacy. If this story of undeniable reality and pervasive secrecy touched your heart and demands that the truth be honored, please subscribe to America's UFO Legacy, hit the notification bell, and join our mission to keep these critical stories alive.